And is there a legacy in Poland of the Scottish migration at all?
Yes, there is. It's really challenging but enjoyable to trace that. Yeah, there's a memory there. Again, this may be slightly controversial, I don't know. I sometimes think it's easiest to start with German traditions, simply because the Poland-Lithuania is partitioned, as we've discussed, at the end of the 18th century. And you find in the 19th century that German writers claim a legacy of the Scots there, particularly in Prussia, and parts of Polish Prussia were of course taken by German Prussia. There's a legacy there. You see it in German newspapers, you see it in some literature. Johanna Schopenhauer from Danzig is a German, ethnically German writer who writes about the Scots a lot and has quite a lot of reflections on that. You see it in place names as well, Germanized place names, or maybe they were German anyway, but German place names within what had been Poland-Lithuania take on significance in Prussia, and the Prussians are interested in that. Now, then you also have a Polish interest in that too. And after 1918, with the creation of the Polish state, for the first time in 123 years, a proper Polish state, you get a reawakening of interest in some of these traditions. You see it in place names, you see it in, even earlier than that, you see it in the literature of Henryk Sienkiewicz, who's well known to any Polish writer, and his works, one of which features a character called Hassling-Ketling. It's an unlikely name for a Scot, but Hassling-Ketling of Elgin gives it away. And he's a Scottish soldier. So it's interesting that the martial tradition is the one that's reflected on by Sienkiewicz. Anyway, to come back to your point, yeah, you still have place names in Poland. You have a certain degree of cultural memory of that phenomenon. And what I found fascinating is, having studied this since the late 90s, is how that's developed even since then. When I talk to people about my interest in this 20 years ago, it didn't provoke quite the same reaction as it does now. And that's partly because of contemporary changes in our society, the growth of a Polish population within Scotland, and the opening up of the European Union.
And do you see any kind of parallels between the Scots going to Poland in the 15th to 18th century and the recent or relatively recent migration of Poles to Scots?
I think there are. I'm always in two minds about how to try to answer these questions as an historian. Yeah, I think there are, and I think that basically these people needed to make money and they wanted to travel to do that, and they found a society that was relatively open for them to do that. That's perfectly reasonable. That's what happens in society. Many people have migrated for those reasons. But that also conceals broader complexities about the society they left. Why had they felt that need? Why were there not those opportunities there? So I think there are parallels. And I think that, you think of a term like economic migrant, it's such a loaded term today, but that's how the Scots were viewed. They tended to be perceived in terms of these people that were keen to make some money and make a profit, which they were, many of them were, of course, but they were coming from a very impoverished society, and we find that Scots leave in years of famine. They're leaving a poor country, and they're seeking out a better future, and they work exceptionally hard to achieve that. So it doesn't take much imagination to put yourself in the mind, I suppose, of a Polish person living in Scotland today and thinking, how do these people feel about me being here? How does that change over time? Why am I not recognised for the contribution I make to the society to the extent that I probably should be? What's home? Where's home? So I think all these kind of fundamental issues do come up, and I think also the other legacy is there are Polish people living in Scotland who are probably descendants of these Scottish migrants that went to Poland, and some of them are maybe even discovering that. Some in this room.
Really interesting, yeah. I know your sort of field of work obviously has been in the Scottish migration. I was wondering what kind of things you're looking to do in the future. What are you discovering and working on at the moment?
Well, I'm really really interested in this event that's taking place tonight, the Trading Places panel, because I think material culture is a really interesting way of looking at this. There are objects we can connect with the Scottish community at the time they were alive. We see that in wills and inventories and things like that. But this idea of the memory of the Scots there is fascinating. Some of my favourite research on this recently has been on gravestones. And there's a historian called Peter Bayer who's done extraordinary work in this field. And he's uncovered gravestones of Scots. And what he shows, amongst many other things, is the presence of Scottish women. And that has not come through in the history writing. And it doesn't come out enough in the written material from archives. But these gravestones depict Scottish women who went either with their husbands or by themselves to Poland. So that's an area I'd like to look at. And the whole material culture around that, I think, would be fascinating. I think we need to look more locally within Poland, because this was a dispersed community. It's not just in Warsaw, Krakow, Gdańsk. Any small town probably had a Scottish population. They found opportunities there. It's not a ghettoised population, it's one that spreads out. So I think that there's all sorts of scope there. But I do think a cross-disciplinary approach could help. And I think this isn't just a topic for historians. And I think if you approach that through the concept of memory, I think there's all sorts of potential in this theme.
That sounds very interesting. I know that you spent some time in Poland yourself during your years, or your academic years especially. I was wondering what your experiences of going out and living in Poland was like.
Okay, thanks. Well, I have no Polish family connection at all, as far as I know. Maybe I do. So, my experience was very positive. I worked in universities. It's perhaps not the experience that everybody would find in Poland, but I found it a great country to live in. I found it inspiring. I found the language extremely difficult, but I enjoyed the challenge. I was just discussing with a colleague here some of the issues around pronunciation, but I think it's an intriguing place, and I don't know if it's my generation that found this particularly interesting. I'm not quite sure, but I was a teenager in the 1980s when Poland was on the news quite a lot. My brother had a Solidarity sticker in his window, and for some reason it connected with me, and as did other parts of Central Europe. But I think we don't recognise in Scotland and Britain how big Poland is. We tend to think of it as a smaller Central European state, not as a state of 40 million people, and a state that has impacted a great deal on European history. In terms of living there, first time I lived in Poland, I was in Kielce, and the second time I worked at the University of Wrocław. So they were two different experiences. I actually really enjoyed living in Kielce because it was my first experience of Poland, I suppose. It was new, it was exciting. I arrived on a February day. It was terrible weather. It was really bleak, but somehow it worked out. Wrocław, very vibrant city, very youthful city, intellectually dynamic. I enjoyed it. I found it a stimulating country to live in.
And how did you find kind of discovering Polish culture and things like that? Was that quite different? Is it quite different to Scotland, or did you find it some similarities?
Yes. I find Polish culture gradually appeared to me, and I think it's connected with language. In fact, the way that when you meet Polish people, you don't immediately get a sense of what the country's like, and I think there's a kind of public and private sphere which are quite different. But when you break the ice, you start to get to know people, and you learn a great deal about its history through these personal connections. I think there is an affinity for Scotland. I think there are also huge differences between the two societies. I don't think they're identical in any way at all. But yeah, when you're travelling through Poland and you're thinking about some of these historical connections, it's really inspiring, because you know that you're following in the footsteps of some of these migrants of the past, and I think that's, for me anyway, as an historian, that's a very resonant thing to consider.